This video is neither an endorsement nor criticism of any state or actor. I strive for neutrality. Hello, everyone. So, just some quick background about myself. I am 31 years old and originally from Kansas City. I moved to Moscow, Russia at the age of 24, and I lived here until March 2022, at which time I moved back to the United States and lived with my parents for about 16 months before leaving for Tbilisi, Georgia, where I worked as a digital nomad for another 2 months. But upon discovering that I had moved abroad without discussing it with my employer, I was fired. And my family and I had essentially no choice but to come back to Moscow, as my wife did not have an American visa or green card, and we already had property in Moscow that we could go live in. And it has now been about 15 months since we initially returned. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it's like to live in Moscow at this time as an American and compare and contrast this with my experience here before February 2022. When I first came to Moscow in September 2017, the ruble was usually around 60 rubles to the dollar, and my first ESL teaching job paid about 90 to 100,000 rubles a month. Although I did supplement this with freelance work that paid an additional 40 to 50,000 rubles a month for my first year. My then girlfriend, now wife, worked as a corporate lawyer, and she made about 45,000 rubles a month. And our rent for a small studio near the center was about 35,000 rubles a month. We lived very comfortably on this, and we even took 3 vacations my first full year in Moscow. And interestingly, at this time, some professionals I spoke to, they spoke about the economy as if it were in a state of crisis because of the enormous crash of the ruble after the initial wave of sanctions in 2014, which were connected to Crimea. I think before the initial wave of sanctions, the ruble was around 30 to the dollar, if I'm not mistaken. But I would need to double check. It fell significantly. Now, instead of giving a line-by-line comparison of basic consumer products in 2017 versus now, I'll just say that even today, in late 2024, grocery prices are generally extremely low. Low enough that about 7,000 rubles a week, which is about $70, is typically more than enough for a family of 3. And you would almost never need to spend more than 10,000 rubles or $100 a week. Taxi prices have risen a lot. Now, these Yandex taxis are these ride-sharing apps. There's only one really in Moscow, but it's not like a luxury like in the United States with Uber. Yandex taxis are they're an integral part of just life here. That's why there's so much information, economic news about the price of taxis. And I take 4 taxis every week, all from one point to another point. And the price of this 1 hour route does fluctuate a little bit just with supply and demand conditions, but it's never more than $30 and never less than $17. And the most common price I pay is about $22. So obviously, a 1 hour taxi for $22 after a significant price increase is still quite good, especially compared with prices in Europe or the United States. I remember people have been complaining about inflation in the United States a lot, really as of late, so the last few years. But to me, even just visiting the United States periodically over the last 7 years, so living in Moscow and then going back to visit the U.S. and then living there, even as early as 2019, I couldn't believe the price differences. I went to Chicago with my parents right before COVID started in early 2020. And I remember paying something like $40 for an hour and a half of parking. Entrees at restaurants none of them were under $20. And this might seem normal to you now, but at that time it really struck me as a huge increase. Now, for comparison, I went to the Moscow Aquarium with my wife and son about 2 weeks ago, and we paid, I think, $1 an hour for parking. And this was in a busy part of the city. It wasn't in some remote area. So what's the catch? What's the massive downside of the economy now? Well, there is a more complicated answer about this that connects with government financing and international banking that is all about the restrictions and the inflow and outflow of foreign currencies and oil and gas sales. But for the regular person, the two most noticeable and consequential factors of the economy are the extremely weak ruble, which is currently about 100 rubles to the dollar, which was considered a sort of worst case scenario maybe 2 years ago. 3 or 4 years ago, 100 rubles to the dollar would have signaled an apocalyptic economic scenario, but that is what it is now. So we have an extremely weak ruble, and we have very, very high interest rates. Now, of course, interest rates are a double-edged sword because you can currently get 21% interest with the equivalent of a certificate of deposit at a bank. In Russia, they're called vklads or a vklad. And you can put your money into one of these vklads and get a 21% return. Now, the actual inflation rate is debated a little bit. I think the official figure is about 10%. Some people claim it's higher, some people claim it's lower, but it's nowhere near 21%. And so all depositors have returned a real profit on their money in a vklad. But at the same time, those who had variable rate mortgages or are trying to secure a first-time car loan or mortgage are having an extraordinarily hard time. I know a couple who are paying a 50% interest on a car loan. And so servicing mortgages and just other types of debt is eating up more and more of consumers' purchasing power. Now, when I first moved to Moscow back in 2017, I was nervous about the geopolitical tensions. I was always very nervous flying in and out of the country and was paranoid about things like mandatory registration for foreigners, which is, if you've ever lived in Moscow, you know what I'm talking about. I was always paranoid about that being done on time or something going wrong or being rejected. And for example, if I realized I'd forgotten my bus pass when I got on the bus and the doors had shut, I was paranoid that the cameras were going to recognize me. I'd be in some database and I'd be thrown into a gulag. That was 7 years ago. So with that neurotic mindset, you'd probably be wondering how I can possibly live here now. And to be honest, that was a major factor for me initially trying to live in Georgia beforehand. Right? Why did I go to Georgia instead of directly back to Moscow after leaving the US? Well, I was just nervous. Essentially, that's a short answer. And during this time, the whole time I was in the US, I was in contact with a couple of friends here and my wife's family who said that things were mostly as before and there were no major differences in ordinary life. And I will say that there's not really any heightened level of anxiety for me just in general or in just ordinary interactions. I am much more nervous flying in and out of the country than I was before, although at the same time I've never had any issues, never been stopped or questioned. People do ask me where I'm from sometimes, and I've always been honest. And while people are surprised, nobody has said anything rude or hostile toward me. Now, in terms of ordinary commodities or basic shopping, it's true you would not know the country was under any sanctions. The replacement of Western brands with Russian ones does seem to have been quite seamless. For example, Vkusnaya Tochka is exactly the same as McDonald's. We now have, I think it's pronounced Rostiks, but I've actually never heard it pronounced out loud. I've only seen it on signs, but it's spelled like Rostiks or Rostiks instead of KFC. And we have Stars Coffee instead of Starbucks. Now, I've not been to Stars, but I have looked at the menu. I have not ordered at Stars. I have seen the menu. And it did look like it was quite different. Unless I'm mistaken, they didn't have the same selection as a Starbucks would. So that's one of the biggest differences. Not very important in the grand scheme of things. You know what is important in the grand scheme of things? Panda Express. Because one of my favorite restaurants in Moscow before the sanctions was Panda Express. And I loved going there because it was the first time in my life I could actually afford it. But after the sanctions, it is now Monkey Express. And it is one of the biggest gaps in quality before and after sanctions of any product I've seen. It's vastly inferior. Their menu has changed noticeably, I guess, because just the availability of different products now, and it sucks. So what do I like more about my life in Moscow? Well, the pros are hard to beat. I have free daycare and healthcare for my son. He's almost 3. He goes to daycare for free. And both he and my wife have free healthcare, and I personally can just pay out of pocket as necessary for much, much less than a monthly insurance plan in the USA. Another big sticking point for me is I love the complete absence of crime, not just in Moscow, but in every Russian city I've visited. Granted, there are some regions. I think there's a city on the border of Mongolia that does have a very high crime rate. But I've been to 4 major Russian cities. I've spent the bulk of my time in Moscow. I spent almost all of my time in Moscow. And comparing crime in a city like Kansas City or Dayton, Ohio, where my parents now live, comparing the crime levels of cities like that now with Moscow, it's like comparing the average temperature in Alaska versus Hawaii. It's not just a little bit colder in Alaska. It's a completely different. It's just there's absolutely there's no comparison whatsoever. They're on completely different planes. They're on completely different levels of the. They're on completely different. You know what I mean? They're just completely different. Now, I've talked about this before, the complete absence of crime. And cynics are people who hate Russia or they have this bizarre bias against the country. They'll tell me, oh, no, crime is bad. Maybe you don't notice it, but it's bad. Okay, well, in Kansas City, I didn't need to research statistics to know we had a crime problem because I saw it with my own eyes. For example, when I lived in the suburbs of Kansas City. I wasn't even in the hood. But in the suburbs of Kansas City, we had a serial killer in my closest park that killed 5 strangers at almost point blank range with a gun. Killed 5 people before he was arrested. One time I arrived at my gym, there were police officers everywhere. It turned out a guy had just pulled in the parking lot, gotten out and shot and killed 3 people. Those are the most extremes in Kansas City, but there are just countless cars that are stolen, cars that are broken into, houses that are broken into. All of these different problems that you just see nonstop. Shootings where nobody dies, shootings at malls, people getting robbed in parking lots. When I went back to the United States in 2022, I was actually in Dayton, Ohio. I wasn't in Kansas City. And again, immediately once we moved back in with my parents, about a 10-minute drive away from us, a guy he breaks into 2 of his neighbors' houses, kills everybody inside, and then flees. That happened immediately after we moved back in. And again, pharmacies and banks were robbed in broad daylight close to where my parents lived. These are things that just don't happen in Moscow. I remember there was a very, very strange case. This was in the center of Moscow. The disgruntled, soon-to-be ex-husband of the CEO of the company Wildberries, which is an online clothing retailer. The story was so strange, but he storms the office and then shot a security guard. And I remember that story. It stood out to me because it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that in the city. Maybe there were other cases and I just missed them, but it was almost the exception that proved the rule to me of just how little random violence there is here compared to with a Midwestern city in America. For example, and again, if there's this phantom crime wave happening, then how come at the libraries people leave their laptops unattended? Not always, but people often leave their bicycles unattended. I've even seen electric scooters left unattended with no lock while people go inside shops. So if there's a phantom crime wave that I'm just not seeing somehow, I can live with it. So what do I miss about the U.S.? Well, to be honest, I really only miss my personal situation. So I miss my family, I miss my friends, and I miss Chipotle. I miss watching things like football on weekends, watching Chiefs highlights the next day on a Monday, alone on a crowded bus, right? It's not as enjoyable as getting drunk at Buffalo Wild Wings eating nachos. And of course, I see the news and I feel nervous, or I have some awkward interaction with somebody because my Russian was bad on that day or whatever. And I do wonder, what would my life have been like if I had moved to another city when I was 24 instead of Moscow? What if I had moved somewhere in Western Europe? What if I had moved to South America? I naturally have those thoughts, like a lot of people who make a major life decision do. But honestly, overall, I'm quite happy with my current situation. It is a complex experience, the situation that I have woken up in. Overall, the cost of living here has been manageable. Daily life seems normal. The ruble is weak. Interest rates are high. Needing a VPN to do absolutely everything online is a huge pain in the ass. But overall, I think just my personal safety level, not to mention the safety level for my wife and son, the free social services, to me, it makes living here definitely worth it. I'm curious what you would do in my situation, if you would stay in Moscow or if you would do everything you could to move to a third country or back to America. Let me know in the comments. Thank you.